Hey, James, I finally found that stinky old boot. James? That's weird. James always loves my stinky old boot. Hey, my phone's all green. I probably dropped it in the silly putty again. Which reminds me, James? Stinky? Green boot?
Walt.
Oh, it's you that's making my phone green. Just wait a second, I'll go grab James.
You are required for Command Zero.
Command Zero? Oh, like that time that you took James on his own. Wait, I don't want to be alone with my thoughts. And my boot?
Initiate transportation sequence to broadcast station.
No. Let me at least drop my boot. Welcome to the Get Commanded podcast. It's the GCP brought to you by POG, Palms Off Gaming, sponsor of this podcast. We're all uniting forces to help you to have better games of Commander. I'm your host, Walt, and I'm on my own. I've been properly kidnapped from my peaceful place with my boot. I'm off in space somewhere. I think I know why, but just to be sure, let's find out what's in store for me here. I have an incoming transmission from the deep depths of the galaxy from the Space Commanders. It's time to get commanded.
Walt, alongside James, you have advocated for adherence to the Rule Zero conversation and have provided guidelines to ensure balanced games of Commander. We require robust examples of these deck descriptions for our database. Provide Command Zero for the deck helmed by Katilda and Lier.
Okay, so basically, for those of you who are new to this one, the Space Commanders want to understand Rule Zero better. They've got this obsession with Rule Zero. They're always trying to talk to us about it. And they want to learn it through the lens of one of my decks. So basically, I'm going to give the absolute best Rule Zero description I possibly can for my Katilda and Lier Commander deck. Of course, it's not going to be a one-to-one representation of how I would actually conduct a Rule Zero conversation if I was in a game with someone, because I wouldn't want to bore them to death with, 20 minutes, I suspect, of description of exactly how my deck wins and all that kind of thing. You can imagine that in an actual Commander game, I would give the same structure and these same things I would say, but I would say it in a much more condensed fashion. So it's sort of like a guide, I hope, for you out there for how to conduct your Rule Zero conversations by seeing how I would do one of mine in massively expanded format. But before we get to that, I think we should just do a quick refresher on Rule Zero itself. So it's otherwise known as the pre-game discussion, and it's worth noting here that the Commander Rules Committee's description of Rule Zero, if you go to their official, official Rules of Commander and the official Commander Rules Committee page, they describe Rule Zero as the place where people discuss whether they would like to bend the rules of Commander to unban cards or just otherwise change the nature of the way that Commander's being played. The reason it's Rule Zero is because it happens at the very beginning of the game, and also that it's basically like their way of saying, Commander is what you make of it. You can decide how you would like to play Commander at the very beginning of the game. You can do whatever you want. Every rule that we give after this one is just a guide, and you can decide how you'd like to adhere to those, if you'd like to adhere to those at all. However, we use the term Rule Zero in the same way that most of the player base does, and probably the way that you've heard it out there, which is that Rule Zero is this catch-all term for everything you talk about before the game starts. So it includes whether illegal cards are being played, it includes a description of proxies if people are using them, deciding how people are going to mulligan, whether they're going to use the regular rules or their own specific mulligan, but most importantly, it includes a discussion of power level. And this is usually when people say, let's have a Rule Zero, they mean, let's describe power level. Let's decide what kind of a game we're after and which kind of decks we're going to pull out for it. So Here at Get Commanded, we're not super keen on the number sort of scale that people often use for this kind of a discussion, where they'll say, oh, my deck's a 7, or my deck's an 8, or oh, it's got, this many cards in it, so I think it's a 5. And we find that those are not really the best descriptions of how a deck is, because they go wrong in a variety of different ways that I won't go into right now. So rather than using the number scale, we recommend using 4 questions. And I'm going to be covering the first 3 questions here today. So the 4 questions are, how does your deck win? Second question is, how consistently does it win? And the third question is, how does your deck stop its opponents from winning? The fourth question that we ask as well is, how much experience have you got playing Commander? How much Commander have you played? How many years have you been playing for? How many decks have you got? That kind of a thing. It's just a really good way of gauging how much skill someone might have moving into the game, because as you would all know, you can give someone a really, really powerful deck, but if they've never played Commander before, it's not going to be that powerful in their hands because they're not going to know the way to win with it, if that makes sense. So, before we get to my Rule Zero description of my deck using those first 3 questions, a little bit of context on this deck. So it's my Katilda and Lier Bant Spellslingery kind of a deck. So this deck is the spiritual successor to my Taigam Ojutai Master Spellslinger deck. That was a blue-white spells deck. And that one was itself a successor to my Kaikar Wind's Fury deck. That's the Jeskai white-blue-red commander that makes spirits when you cast non-creature spells. So I've tried to build Spellslinger decks a bunch of times, is what I'm trying to say. But this is the one that I've actually found the most satisfying, because it doesn't do the usual Spellslinger thing of taking extremely long turns, right? We've all been there when someone's storming off and they're taking 25 minutes to resolve just all the different effects they've got, Magecraft is happening, all this kind of stuff. It gets boring. I tried to avoid doing that because I don't like being even in the driver's seat when that's happening. And I think I've got it with this particular deck. But I'll go into it a bit more later. But basically the main reason I like this deck is because it doesn't have Spellslinger win cons. It wins through other ways. Now, I'll go into that in a sec. But before that, I should probably tell you what Katilda and Lier even does. So let's do that. Katilda and Lier is a legendary creature human for green, white, blue. So the color identity is green, white, blue, or Bant, as it's called. It's a 3/3 human that says, whenever you cast a human spell, target instant or sorcery card in your graveyard gains flashback until end of turn. The flashback cost is equal to its mana cost. So flashback, by the way, is a keyword ability that says you may cast this card from your graveyard for its flashback cost, then exile it. So in other words, Katilda and Lier lets you cast humans, and when you cast humans, your spells get to come back from the graveyard and you get to use them again, and then they're exiled and they're gone forever. But it lets you use all your spells again, so you kind of get this double duty out of all of your cards, but you have to play a bunch of humans. So it's this sort of weird balancing act between humans and spells. So I sort of described this deck as a counter-spell-less control deck. There's not a single counter-spell in this deck, but there's a bunch of sort of weird removal and protection spells so that I can keep a handle on my opponents without counter-spelling, because I just find counter-spells in control decks tend to get a little bit boring. As with most of the decks that I've built, this was built on a budget, so it only comes to about $150, I think, US all up. And you can check out my Moxfield list, which will be linked in the show notes if you'd like to see this deck in its entirety yourself. But that's not what we're here to do. We're here to talk about Rule Zero. So the first question we need to ask is, how does this deck win? So, I said before, it's not like a typical Spellslinger deck. There aren't any Storm cards in here. There's no Aetherflux Reservoir or anything that cares about how many spells I've cast in a turn. It's a spell that literally says Storm on it. There's nothing like that in the deck. Instead, mostly we're going to be going wide. So we're casting a bunch of humans, and we're also casting a bunch of spells, and through that we want to be having a really wide board, and that's how we're going to win. We're going to make a bunch of creatures and attack with them. So ideally we want effects that make bodies whenever we cast spells. And the absolute best one in the deck, in my opinion, is got to be Monastery Mentor. For 2 and a white, this is the 2/2 human monk with prowess. So when you cast non-creature spells, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn. And whenever you cast a non-creature spell, create a 1/1 white monk creature token with prowess. So this is the absolute best token maker in the deck. Every single time I cast a non-creature spell, it doesn't even have to be an instant or sorcery, could be an enchantment, could be an artifact. I'm going to be making a monk, and then those monks are going to get bigger when I cast more and more spells. So it's got that ability to go wide, but also to go tall, with the monks getting bigger and bigger. A very, very different card in the deck that also works for a similar way is Dekar Fractal Theorist. For 4 and a blue, this is a 3/3 human wizard with Magecraft. So this is triggers whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell. You create a 0/0 green and blue fractal creature token, and you put X +1 counters on it, where X is that spell's mana value. Has more text on it that doesn't matter. So yeah, basically you cast a 3 mana instant, get a 3 mana creature. Cast a 5 mana instant, get a 5 mana creature. Cast a 7 mana sorcery, get a 7 mana creature. It scales really, really well with the spells that you use, and the tokens that it makes can get very, very big and very, very out of hand very, very quickly. That's a really, really good way to go wide and have those creatures that are really big. And alternatively, I found the most common win con in this deck is Increasing Devotion. It's basically a 1-card combo with my commander that I'll go into in a sec, but this is the sorcery for 3 white. It creates 5 1/1 human creature tokens, and if this spell was cast from a graveyard, create 10 of those tokens instead. It's got flashback for 7 white, which is 9 mana, a bit much to pay, but the really interesting thing you can do with this deck with spells that have flashback already is with your commander, when you cast a human spell, if this is in your graveyard, you can give it flashback again, and the flashback cost is now its mana cost. So it has basically got 2 lines of text on it now. One of them says flashback 7 white, and the other one says flashback 3 white. Now, really importantly for Increasing Devotion, it cares about whether it was cast from a graveyard. It doesn't care about how much mana you spent to cast it. So if this is in your graveyard, Increasing Devotion, and you cast a human spell and you got Katilda and Lier out, you can give it that extra line of text of flashback for 3 white, and when you flash it back for, again, 5 mana for the second time, it's going to make 10 humans still, because it's still been cast from a graveyard. Very, very cool little synergy there. I found it's a very good way to just go extremely wide very, very quickly. It's not hard, obviously, to cast a human and then pay 5 mana to get 10 1/1s. But of course, if we're going to be going wide, we're also going to need to pump up the team. It's not usually enough to have a bunch of 1/1s. You need to make them big in order to end the game. So there's a few different effects I want to highlight here for actually making the team nice and big for going for that lethal swing at the end of the game. One of them is Intrepid Adversary. So this is a 3/1 human scout for 1 and a white. It has lifelink, and when it enters the battlefield, you may pay 1 and a white any number of times. When you pay this cost 1 or more times, put that many Valor counters on Intrepid Adversary. And creatures you control get +1/+1 for each Valor counter on Intrepid Adversary. So in other words, you pay 1 and a white to cast this spell. You pay, again, 1 and a white any number of times that you would like. This gets that many counters, and your creatures get that much bigger. So if you pay 8 mana altogether, so 2 mana for the creature, and then 6 mana for 3 of those Valor counters, your creatures just have a static +3/+3, which is going to be a very effective way of ending the game, of course. Very, very good to have that as a static effect as well, because it's going to block really well. Your whole team's going to be big just perpetually, so it's going to, mean you can block some lethal combat damage that's coming at you. And this one's also really good because it scales with the game. So if you get late in the game, you can pay more mana, but if it's early in the game and you just want a little bit of a buff to get around some sort of effect that's on the table, you can just pay 1 and a white maybe once or twice, and you're still going to get a little bit of a buff from it. Very, very cool. Love that card a lot. The next one here, and this one works really well with Increasing Devotion, is Kyla, Guardian Emissary. For 3 green-white, you're going to get a 2/2 human cleric that says, whenever another human enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1 counter on Kyla, Guardian Emissary. And other humans you control get +1/+1 for each counter on Kyla. So the really good one to do here is to flashback Increasing Devotion with Kyla on the battlefield, because it's going to be 10 humans entering the battlefield, which is going to put 10 +1 counters on Kyla, which means that all of your humans are going to get +10/+10. So yes, just by having Kyla and flashing back Increasing Devotion, you've got 10 11 11s. That's 110 power from 10 mana. Very, very, very cool. Like that card a lot. And obviously, if you cast more humans, they get bigger and bigger again. Cool card. Bit risky. You got to pay 5 for it. But if you can make it stick around for a little while, it is going to pay off. The last pump effect here is a very old-fashioned one for a lot of mana, though. It's Kamal, Heart of Crowsurf, a 6 green. It's a legendary creature, human druid. He's a 5/5, and he says, at the beginning of combat, on your turn, creatures you control get +3/+3 and gain trample until end of turn. There's more text on it, but who cares about that? The most important thing is every single beginning of your combat, I should say, your creatures are going to get +3/+3 and trample. That is straight up the card Overrun. For those of you who don't remember, that's why we call things Overrun effects. It's giving them +3/+3 and trample. That's going to end the game a lot of the time, which is very cool. It does cost 8 mana. It's one of the only 2 8 mana spells in the entire deck. And for reference, because this is a sort of spells deck and a humans deck that cares about casting lots of spells, there are no 6 or 5 drops in this deck. No 6 or 7 mana spells in this deck. So this is very comfortably the top of the curve, but it does mean it's going to take me quite a while to get to it. I am going to say here that I think I should be considering maybe playing just the card Overrun here, the 5 mana sorcery, because I have the ability to recur it again from my graveyard using my commander's ability, which would mean +6/+6 and trample until end of turn, instead of +3/+3, which could maybe end the game a bit better. This deck is not so good at actually ending the game, I would say. Despite having these effects in there, it can do it, and it has done it before, but it might need just a little bit more, maybe just another card or 2 that will actually end the game in it. So maybe Overrun might be one I need to take a look at. But that's how the deck wins. The next question we ask in our template, of course, is how consistently does it win? So there's a few things to consider when we're looking at this question. I think speed is going to be one of them. So I will say there is no fast mana in the deck whatsoever, not even a Soul Ring. So there's no Crypt, Soul Ring, any of those sorts of effects in the deck. And there's also no tutors in the deck. So there's no spells that will search for other spells or search for other humans or anything like that in the deck. So in other words, if I'm going to find cards that I need to use, I have to draw them, which is less consistent and a bit slower typically than using tutors to go and fetch the cards that you need at the time that you need them. So that's one way that it slows down a little bit. I would say as well that just by virtue of the strategy that the deck is trying to use, it is a little bit slow. You need to fill your bin with a bunch of spells, then you need to have some humans, then you need to make some tokens, and then you need to get that overrun effect. There's just a few ifs that you have to be, hoops you have to jump through to get to that win. You have to sort of do them in the right order, and if someone interrupts you somewhere along the way by board wiping or something like that, it's going to take you quite a long time to get back to where you needed to be. And a lot of the early game in this deck is just ramping and sculpting a good hand. That said, the ramp is quite good in the deck. It's mostly 2 mana sorceries that just find lands from your deck and put them onto the battlefield tapped, rampant growth, that kind of a thing, because I can recur them with humans. So those are very, very good ramp pieces though, and not to be slept on for sure. And there's plenty of cheap card draw spells, like cards like Preordain and that kind of thing, that are just going to look at a few cards, pick the best one and put it into your hand. And when you stack a lot of those on top of each other, you tend to have the best cards in your hand a good chunk of the time. All that said, so considering all those different factors, I would say this deck is fairly slow, and it was pretty specifically built for very casual pods. It's sort of supposed to sit around a pre-con level, and I think it's basically there. It's probably a little bit more consistent than a pre-con, but maybe the win cons are slightly worse. So I don't know, maybe it sort of balances out to roughly pre-con level. It fits in pretty well at a very casual pod. Anyone who's sort of also playing a pretty slow game plan or takes a little while to get set up, anything like that, it's going to sit in well at a pod like that. For reference, those of you who may remember from a few episodes back, I kept a game log of 50 of my Commander games. This was the deck I played the most times. I think I played it 7 times in the 50 games that I played and tracked. I only won... No, never mind. I lost every one of those games. I think I've only played it about 2 times outside of the game log, and I think I've only won one of those. So if my memory is correct, that means I've played the deck 9 times, and I've won once and lost 8 times. So that should tell you that it's going to struggle a bit for consistency, and it's definitely a deck that belongs at casual tables. Now, the third question that we ask in our template is, how does this deck stop its opponents from winning? So I'll say right off the bat, there aren't any of the really salt-inducing sorts of effects that you might see mentioned in this question, like stacks pieces or land destruction or just anything that generally induces a lot of salt. We're just playing regular old removal. But it does, in terms of stopping my opponents from winning, like I said, this is a deck that doesn't play counterspells, but does have some weird answers to questions to try and slow down my opponents while I construct the perfect board. So I'll highlight some of those cards that do tend to answer people's problems pretty well. Dramoka's Command is the first one here. For green and a white, it's an instant that says choose 2, and that's got 4 modes. The first mode is prevent all damage target instant or sorcery spell would deal this turn. The second is target player sacrifices an enchantment, or put a +1 counter on target creature, or target creature you control fights target creature you don't control. So this is a card that's never amazing, but is also never bad. You can typically choose from those 4 categories there, at least a couple that are pretty good for right now. If someone's got only 1 enchantment and you make them sacrifice it, that's a really, really good enchantment removal spell. If someone's trying to cast a big burn spell to remove your board, like a Blasphemous Act, you can respond by preventing all the damage that would be dealt by Blasphemous Act. That's a really good one. I've used that a couple of times. And otherwise, it lets you fight stuff. That's also can be good removal if you've got a nice big board. If you've got Kyla, for instance, which gets bigger, I highlighted that before, it gets bigger when you have more humans entering the battlefield. That's a good one to fight one of your opponent's creatures. It's just a really good one to have open for 2 mana. You're basically never going to be sad to cast 1 or more of those modes. The next one I wanted to highlight is another modal spell. This is maybe my favorite Magic card ever. It's Dawn Charm. For 1 and a white, you'll get an instant that says choose 1. It's got 3 modes. First mode is prevent all combat damage that would be dealt this turn. The second is regenerate target creature. And the third is counter target spell that targets you. I know, I'm a liar. I read the words counter target spell in there, but it has to target me in order to counter that spell. So that it will counter like a burn spell or, one of those sorts of effects that says target player sacrifices a creature. It would counter that. But otherwise, it's not going to counter anything. It has to target me specifically. But mostly, it's just really good to have open for 1 and a white. You're going to either fog, which feels pretty good if someone attacks you with a bunch of creatures, you just prevent all the damage that they're going to deal. Regenerating a creature is going to be really good. It's going to be a good way to protect Katilda and Lier. And yeah, you're basically, again, it's a good one to have open for 2 mana that's not a counter spell, or kind of a counter spell. But you're always going to have something that you'd like to do with that mana, I suspect. Now, the third spell I wanted to highlight here in terms of stopping my opponents from winning is Harsh Mercy. For 2 and a white, you'll get a sorcery that says, each player chooses a creature type. Destroy all creatures that aren't of a type chosen this way. They can't be regenerated. So this is a 3 mana board wipe, but with some hoops to jump through, because it can be very one-sided. If I choose human and, everyone else chooses whatever creature type their commander is, everything else gets destroyed unless people's things share types, which can happen, can get weird in that way. It can blow up pretty much the whole board. It'll never touch my board because I'll choose humans, which is very, very cool. But the thing is, a lot of the time, if someone's like, at the time when you want to board wipe, there's usually 1 or more players who have a bunch of creatures, and they're usually the same creature type. If you're playing against a goblin deck, someone's got a bunch of goblins. Or if someone's playing a token deck, they've probably got a bunch of saprolings because they've been playing, that creature that makes a saproling every upkeep. Tend to shoot dryad, that kind of a thing. Those tends to be the answers, the problems you're trying to answer with your board wipe. And if someone just chooses saproling as creature type, they just keep all of that stuff. This is also a card that's really bad against other decks that have humans in them. I did a little bit of a stats. I prepared for this episode a tiny bit by reading the command. And in terms of other commanders out there, there are 717 creatures that are human and can be your commander. So there's a lot of human commanders running around out there. And of the 100 most played commanders of the last month on EDH Rec, 35 of them are human. So a good chunk of the time, this is not going to blow up someone's commander. About a third of the time, 35 out of 100. So yeah, I think I will probably end up subbing this card out for an austere command or something else that sort of board wipes and leaves my board, deals with other people's boards, but doesn't deal with nothing, which Harsh Mercy sometimes can. But I might need to do additional testing for Harsh Mercy and see if it works. It is a 3-mana board wipe that never touches my board, so it is pretty cool in that way. Well, this is not my fastest, most powerful, or even most consistent deck, but it is comfortably one of the most fun. There are several avenues to victory, and all of them are paved with fun micro decisions that involve some of my favourite and most versatile creatures and spells. It sits at a really comfy low power level, only a little higher than a precon, but really rewards clever sequencing and decisions. This is one of very few decks I own that is fun to lose with, which is a really good thing, because this deck loses a lot. So, Space Commanders, command received. And to the listeners out there, do you feel commanded? What do you think of my Katilda and Lier deck? And you can, of course, find my Moxfield profile linked in the show notes, where you can check out the full deck yourself if you're interested in building your own deck or just seeing more of it. And of course, don't forget to check out our Patreon page, which is linked in the show notes for more ways to support the Get Commanded podcast directly. There's lots of really cool things on offer there, including we can evaluate your decks. So if you want to build your own Katilda and Lier deck and have me take a look at it, you can do that and just send us a little bit of money and we'll do that for you. We would like to thank our patrons, Stella Tam, Fuzzy, and Bottomless Potamus, and an extra special shout out to Fletcher Cutting, who supports us in the Space Commander tier. You're the best. And thank you again to Palms Off Gaming, who sponsor this podcast. They make some really, really fantastic deck boxes, sleeves, binders, and basically any gaming accessory you could ever need for your card game needs. You can check them out at palmsoffgaming.com.au/#GetCommanded. And if you use that link, you'll receive a 10% discount on your purchase, and you'll be supporting the Get Commanded podcast at the same time. That's palmsoffgaming.com.au/#GetCommanded. Now, we're supposed to Planeswalk here at the end of the episode, out of Magic. I think I'd like to Planeswalk back to Earth if the Space Commanders will let me. Oh, I feel a funny beam. Oh, okay. All right, I'm back. I'm back in Melbourne, Australia. This looks like my room. Things seem to be normal. I think I'm out of there. So thanks for sticking with me while I did that. I would like to just mention briefly here that James will be back from Europe for next week's episode. So I know there's been episodes coming out for the last 3 weeks, even though he's been gone, for those of you who know James personally. But those have been recorded well in advance. But thankfully, when he comes back, the episodes will just be episodes from now or, 5 days prior or whatever, instead of 3 weeks in the past. So yes, I've got that to look forward to. I'm looking forward to having him back and seeing him again. We'll see you next Friday for another transmission from the Space Commanders. Goodbye, Commander players. Bye.